Welcome back to another episode of Historic Headstones of Norfolk. We are here in Elmwood Cemetery in downtown Norfolk today. We are going to be talking about yellow fever, one of the most devastating things to happen to Norfolk besides the Civil War. These are the two events that really shaped Norfolk to what it is today. We are going to be talking about Dr. George Upshur today. Two men climbed over the ship's railing, climbed down the side, and splashed into the Elizabeth River. They thrashed around in the water and then swam towards the nearest point of land. Their ship, the Benjamin Franklin, had steamed in from the West Indies and anchored off Fort Norfolk in June 1855. Within days, crew members would drag a rolled mattress onto the deck, remove the corpse, and put it into a coffin. They would throw the mattress overboard, ferry the coffin to the Portsmouth side of the river, and bury it under the cover of night. At the same time, another man's body, dressed like that of the ship's coal heaver, would wash up at the fort. His hands were as yellow as lemons. Now men on the ship were jumping overboard. One of them floundered and nearly went under, but both eventually crawled up onto land. Why did they risk their lives? Better to chance drowning than to stay on the ship and face certain death. What happened the next 2 days would change the history of Norfolk forever. It would send thousands fleeing from Norfolk and Portsmouth, wipe out entire families, and it would orphan children too young to know their own names. It started June 7th when the Benjamin Franklin pulled into Hampton Roads. It had left St. Thomas 2 weeks earlier en route to New York, but needed repairs and detoured towards Portsmouth for repairs, bringing yellow fever to Hampton Roads. Could you imagine if it didn't need repairs and pulled into New York City? How devastating this would have been, even more than what it was to Hampton Roads. From previous outbreaks in the South, people in Norfolk and Portsmouth knew almost everything about the fever. They knew it came during hot weather, shortly after the arrival of a ship from the tropics, that it broke out in swampy areas first, where water became stale. They knew that during an outbreak, something poisonous and deadly filled the air. They just did not know what. Within a few days, the first case of yellow fever was reported in Portsmouth in a house by the piers where the Franklin had tied up. Then on July 3rd, a machinist who came from Richmond looking for a job found work on the Franklin. They had aquaspeeds. They needed help. 2 days later, he began feeling restless and depressed, and then came the aches in his head, back, and joints. His face became flushed, his pulse irregular, and his eyes became glassy. By July 8th, he was dead. 2 Navy doctors who had seen cases of the fever were called in to examine the man's body. One doctor held a man's nostrils shut, and another pressed down on his chest. And others standing around startled when black fluid gushed from the man's mouth. The Navy doctors knew what this was, the final horrific blow of yellow fever, the black vomit. A person could get the fever and survive, but once the black vomit came, death was soon at hand. There was no stopping it. The city council in Portsmouth instructed the shipyard be shut down. The ship moved out of the city, and a bridge that connected Portsmouth and Norfolk was to be destroyed to keep people from crossing from the infected area. People set about in Portsmouth trying to clean the city's filth and remove garbage from yards, but it was too late. The yellow fever was here to stay. Many people in Norfolk were scared that the fever would hop the Elizabeth River and devastate Norfolk as it was doing to Portsmouth. In early August, it only took a month for the fever to cross the river. Dr. George Upshur had reported the first cases in Norfolk. He suspected that it was the same strain of yellow fever that was devastating Portsmouth. He discovered the first cases in Barry's Row, a crowded Irish tenement built where Church Street dead-ended at the river. It was pretty much an Irish ghetto. Many had criticized him for delaying too long and making the news public, while others mocked his diagnosis as fiction and that would harm the city's commerce. Critics called it the Upshur fever. We've seen behavior like this right now during the pandemic. All right, by this time, Portsmouth was a ghost town with an average of 30 deaths a day. City Market was empty. The streets were quiet, except for the undertaker taking bodies to local cemeteries. In a month, 10,000 people had fled the city. The poor had stayed behind, and they were the ones who were dying from the fever. An attack began with weariness, restlessness, and depression, soon followed by headaches and pain in the back and joints. In the middle of summer, it would bring a high fever, a symptom there was no medicine for. The assault on the body became more grave after 3 to 5 days. Extreme weakness set in. The face and eyes flushed red and then yellow when the liver ceased working. In worst case scenario, mucous membranes failed and blood oozed from ears, nose, mouth, or any opening. When the bleeding passed through the stomach, it became black vomit. The fever's assault made people babble senselessly, moan, wail loudly, and want to tear everything away that was touching their bodies. By mid-August, the fever spread all over Norfolk. Norfolk was seeing 88 new cases a day. It was extremely hard for local authorities to track the number of deaths. Too many people were dying daily. Norfolk was now a ghost town as well. Business has ceased, church services were suspended, and the sound of hearse rattling through the silent streets could be heard day and night. The only commercial vessel to continue to call at the port was a little steamer bringing mail, medicine, and coffins, and doctors and nurses from around the country came to volunteer their services. So many people have died from yellow fever during those months that we have a burial pit over at Cedar Grove. We have a burial pit over at Princess Anne and Hampton. There's people, I mean, this cemetery opened in 1853 and we are already 10% full at 1855 with the fever. If you go across the street in Cedar Grove, there are 1855 yellow fever burials everywhere in the old section over there. You can't miss it. There's entire families wiped out by it buried over there. Okay, as many as 80 to 100 people died each day. They were counted by officials. Now, families that were poor to have family burial grounds buried their own dead, they were never counted. Coffins stacked on the ground at the cemeteries with no one to dig the graves, and many victims simply wrapped in bedcloths in which they had died and were buried in mass unmarked graves. The fever abated after the first frost in October, and the editor of Norfolk Southern Argus wrote, "In the short space of 90 days, out of the average population of 6,000, every man, woman, and child, almost without exception, has been stricken, and about 3,000 have been buried." That is a lot of people. Unfortunately for the human race, the fever cannot be passed directly from person to person. To acquire disease, an individual must be bitten by an affected mosquito, and a certain period of time must have passed since the mosquito first acquired the virus itself. This allows a small window of opportunity for the virus to spread, although the window grows a lot in locations with large unprotected populations and significant mosquito activity like Hampton Roads. Yellow fever kills 30,000 people globally each year, even though there is no vaccine for it. Most poor countries cannot afford it. What happened to George? He was bitten by an affected mosquito and he passed away 5 days after he got sick. He died a hero. He not only warned people here that it was coming, he also treated people here until he died. So he was a local hero during the pandemic in 1855. This is one of the two major events that shaped Norfolk and what it is today. This and the Civil War. All right, guys, take care. Stay safe during this pandemic. Practice social distancing and do everything you can to stay safe. Take care.